This is China.
Shanghai! Shanghai! Shanghai!
Protests are breaking out all over the country against the CCP and their authoritarian rule. As the number of protesters grow, the CCP is worried more and more about things getting out of control. Just a few days ago, protests in Shengshao turned violent between authorities and protesters. As of Saturday night, there are protests happening in 13 Chinese cities and around 80 Chinese universities. By the time I finish editing this video, these numbers are likely to be much bigger. According to several experts, this is the most serious moment in China's history since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. Because of the threat these protests represent for the CCP, government censors have been quick to block any and all news of these protests from social media. There are signal jammers following the protesters, so they can't post on the internet and communicate with other people. Websites and apps like Weibo and WeChat went dark to stop people from sharing the news about the protests. If there's an off chance that CCP bots may try downvoting this video, I want you guys to take a quick second and hit that like button below. It would help me out a lot. This is the first time ever under President Xi Jinping that Chinese citizens are openly opposing the central government and their rule. This is the first time in a long time people have voiced their opinions against the government, despite what it means for their personal safety. You might be wondering what changed all of a sudden that citizens are so furious with the CCP. The reason behind these protests was a fire in an apartment building in ERUPT, where an estimated 10 people died, and it was all because of the CCP's mismanagement. So before talking more about what these protests mean for the CCP's rule, let's back up a little bit and talk about how a fire in a faraway region gave rise to a movement that threatens the CCP's existence.
His overall policy of zero COVID policy.
There are constant lockdowns and mandatory PCR tests around every corner.
Fences to stop people leaving their flats.
Using bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
Electronic magnetic alarms are going to be placed on the front doors of some people in places where they have tested.
Problems started brewing back in March, when China experienced a spike in daily record COVID cases. The CCP made COVID public enemy number one and decided to get China into its utopia-like goal of zero COVID. To achieve this goal, the CCP implemented zero COVID restrictions to stop the spread. If there was even just a single positive COVID case, the CCP would lock down millions of people, shut down thousands of businesses, and implement excessive mass testing. Doing all this basically crippled people's daily lives. But that didn't matter to President Xi Jinping. The government was dealing with COVID as if it was still 2019, all while the rest of the world has moved on. When I say lockdown, I don't mean like a normal lockdown. No. Just like anything the CCP does, this was forceful. Apartment buildings were locked from the outside so people couldn't leave. Neighborhoods were barricaded. And if there was any suspicion of someone having COVID, they were forcefully removed from their family and quarantined in a very much jail cell-looking facility. Even infants and toddlers were not an exception to this rule. Yes, you heard that right. The CCP would actually separate kids from their parents and put them in a quarantine facility. Turns out all of these very forceful policies are now what is coming back to bite the CCP. But we'll get into that in just a second.
In one of the world's richest cities, residents scream, "Give us food." Last week, they were so hungry they ransacked a grocery store.
The world's third largest city remains in lockdown. 25 million residents ordered confined to their homes.
They're using bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
You're shut in. There's like a paper barrier keeping you from exiting, going to the food market.
I can't go outside that door. There's a seal.
In this apartment complex, a woman screams, "We are starving to death."
It's straight out of a dystopian sci-fi movie. Some people are yelling out, We're starving.
Initially, it was an inconvenience for citizens, since they've learned to let the government overreach slide, just as long as the CCP achieves their goals that improve Chinese citizens' lives. Now remember, that's the most important part. As long as the CCP achieves its goal. The goal of these lockdowns was to kill COVID, achieve a zero COVID target set by President Xi Jinping. But as the days passed, then the weeks passed, then months passed, it didn't seem like the CCP was getting any closer to achieving their goal. In fact, the COVID cases just kept spiking. You can feel that Chinese citizens were getting tired of giving up their lives for something that doesn't seem to be working. Slowly, a movement started brewing. Social media posts started circulating about how lockdowns just don't work and people want their lives back. Worse yet, posts about people dying because of these lockdown measures started picking up steam like wildfire. On November 3rd, a 3-year-old boy died in his father's hands after a gas leak because a COVID worker wouldn't let them leave the apartment complex to seek treatment for the child. The delay proved fatal for the kid whose whole life consisted of lockdown and pandemic. This caused a massive uproar on Chinese social media, before posts were quickly taken down to contain the crisis. Then there was another huge protest at Apple's Foxconn facility. And you guessed it, it was because of lockdown measures. Foxconn had its workers working in this closed-loop management system, where workers would work, live, and sleep in the factories. They were allowed no outside contact at all. As workers slowly got sick of all this, protests broke out and the news reached the international media. Things got so out of hand that there were violent clashes between the workers and the police. Unfortunately, I can't show all the clips because of the YouTube community guidelines, but here are just some of the clips to give you an idea. If you want more news and clips like this, be sure to follow me on Twitter, as I share things there a lot quicker and more openly.
China, news of the protests is censored, but internationally the optics aren't good. Critics say Apple has put itself in a difficult situation with an extreme dependence on China as a manufacturer and as a consumer market.
You can probably tell by now protests are picking up. But until now, they were still under control. Until the fire in ERUPT. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This is what gave rise to the protests across the nation. This is what led to people chanting in the streets against the CCP and Xi Jinping. This is why current events are considered the most serious moment in China's history since Tiananmen Square.
Media footage from China appears to show people in the western city of ERUPT protesting against COVID restrictions. This is after a fire in a block of flats killed 10 people.
According to state media, the cause of the fire was a short circuit in the electrical panel.
Came after an apartment block fire killed 10 people.
ERUPT officials denied that COVID measures had hampered escape and rescue, but said they would investigate further.
On November 24th, 8:35 p.m., a building under this zero COVID lockdown caught on fire. Residents of the building had been locked in for more than 3 months. And when the fire started, they couldn't get out because the doors were most likely locked from the outside. On top of that, the fire department was unable to get into the compound of the building for 3 hours after the fire started because the compound was barricaded so people couldn't leave. In this clip, you can see the fire department trying to put out the fire, but water couldn't reach the building because they were so far away. It's just sad. The fire resulted in 10 people dead, including 3 children, and left 9 more hospitalized. As the news of the fire spread through the nation, protests broke out across the country. Officials tried blaming the fire victims for their deaths. They claimed that the victims were not strong enough to save themselves, while the people blamed the CCP and its strict COVID policy for the deaths. It's also important to note that the protests first started in ERUPT, which is in Xinjiang. Crowds took to the streets on Friday night in ERUPT, chanting "End the lockdown" and pumping their fists in the air. Video showed people in a plaza singing China's national anthem with its lyric, "Rise up, those who refuse to be slaves," while others shouted that they wanted to be released from lockdowns. This kind of uprising is rare in these regions, where authorities in 2017 launched a security clampdown that forced more than 1 million of the region's Uyghur, Kazakh, and other mostly Muslim peoples into re-education programs. Shanghai was another region where massive protests took place. Late on Saturday night, hundreds of residents gathered for a candlelight vigil on ERUPT Road to mourn the victims of the fire. This was captured on videos widely circulated and promptly censored on Chinese social media. By the way, another reminder to please give this video a like, just in case any bots are trying to suppress the news. People also chanted, "We need human rights, we need freedom," while also calling for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to step down. The crowd also chanted, "We don't want COVID tests, we want freedom. And we don't want a dictatorship, we want democracy." Then, in the early morning, rows of police officers, who were initially just observing, started to move in and push the crowd back, dividing them. This sparked a tense face-off between the police and the protesters. According to a CNN report, several people were arrested and taken into police custody shortly after. Several were also taken behind police lines. Numerous videos showed hundreds of people at an intersection shouting, "Release the people," in a demand for the police to free the detained demonstrators. Even in Beijing, protests are picking up too. People are shouting, "No nucleic acid testing, we want food to eat. No lockdowns, we want freedom. No lies, we want dignity. No cultural revolution, we want reform. No dictatorial leaders, we want elections. No slaves, we want to be citizens." Even as I'm writing this script, there's news of the Chinese police targeting journalists if they are caught recording videos on their phones. The CCP is also kicking out foreign reporters to limit the information that gets out of China about this situation. Many of these protests have broken out on university campuses, which are particularly politically sensitive to the Communist Party, given the history of the student-led Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. As of writing this script, there are over 70 universities where protests have taken place against COVID controls. In my opinion, the most notable one being Tsinghua University, which is a top-tier university in China, and also Xi Jinping's alma mater. There, the students chanted, "We need democracy, we need rule of law, we want freedom of expression." It seems like protests are picking up by the second. This is a very important story in China's history, and it's moving pretty fast. This is probably one of the fastest videos we have ever put together. The chances of another pandemic coming are low, but that doesn't mean that YouTube is not growing. In fact, YouTube just overtook Netflix in terms of how much time people spent on their TVs. And that's just television. Imagine how much time people are watching YouTube if you combine TV, phones, and computers. If you're waiting on a sign to start a channel, well, this may be the perfect one. And if you are looking to learn how people grow on YouTube in 2024, like this guy who got millions of views in just 2 months after starting, then I have the solution for you. We are opening up the waitlist for our first ever YouTube Basic Academy cohort. Here, we not only share the secrets we have learned about uploading for years on YouTube, we also share how we're able to start channels in completely different niches and scale them to millions of views in just a few months. We will also have live Q&As, a community where everyone can interact and learn from each other, and much more. If you want information on the cohort, then just click on the link in the description or scan the QR code that's on the screen right now. You can also sign up for the waitlist there. Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia on December 9th. The rumored goal of the visit was to convince the Saudi Crown Prince to ditch the USA as an ally and join China's plan to dismantle the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. You see, this visit, and many others, are all part of the CCP's plan to become the world's strongest superpower, and the only way the CCP achieves that goal is by dethroning the dollar from its status as the world's strongest currency. So in today's video, let's go over why the CCP hates the dollar's power and how it plans to strip it away.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Saudi Arabia. Since President Xi arrived, the Saudi energy minister has been speaking. What has he been saying?
You have to remember, this is a way of Saudi Arabia seeking new alliances with other countries outside of the United States.
Chinese President Xi Jinping wants oil-producing nations to stop using the U.S. dollar in their sales to China. It's part of a campaign to de-dollarize the world economy.
For us to truly understand why the dollar is so powerful, we have to back up a little bit and look at how the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Back before World War I, the British pound was the world's reserve currency, as they were the strongest economy, and they had the most gold. Currencies were basically all backed up by gold at this time. But World Wars I and II destroyed the UK's economy, and most European countries' economies, all while the US economy had massive growth during this period, and was able to accumulate massive amounts of gold, as you can see from this chart. At one point after World War II, the US had more than 3/4 of the world's gold reserves. This gave massive leverage to the USA government. So, the government used this leverage to gather all the major countries at the Bretton Woods Conference, and got a lot of them to agree to peg their currency to the US dollar, and the US dollar was then pegged to gold. Now, a lot of people point to this event in history and claim that the US dollar got its place as a world reserve currency by taking advantage of other countries that were struggling economically after the two world wars. Which, I mean, this is just not true at all. All right, let me explain. These countries didn't sign the Bretton Woods Agreement because they were forced to. No. They signed this agreement because it was in their best interest to do so. The US was the strongest economy, which meant that it was the most stable one. So countries felt extremely comfortable pegging their currency to the US dollar. Once countries pegged their currency to dollars, the stability that came with it made it easier for businesses to trade across borders, which in turn helped these countries rebuild faster after the war. On top of that, the Bretton Woods Agreement also created the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF's job is to monitor the exchange rates of all currencies and help countries maintain their peg to the US dollar. The World Bank, on the other hand, actually loaned money to countries to help them with post-war recovery efforts. As you can see now, the US played a big part in helping countries recover from the world wars, and that's why these countries accepted the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, this agreement was great to help countries recover from the war, and part of the Bretton Woods infrastructure still remains today. But as the United States started spending more and more on domestic programs and foreign wars, everyone realized that this peg to gold was unsustainable for the long term. That's why in 1971, US President Richard Nixon put a temporary pause on dollar redemption for gold. And that pause was never lifted, thus taking the dollar off the gold standard.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Now, the United States was still the strongest economy, but for the US dollar to still be the world's reserve currency, there needs to be a lot of demand for their currency, so that market price is always at a fair value. Otherwise, any big transaction would move the price too much and make things even more complicated for international trade. So instead of creating demand through gold, the US government decided to create demand through oil, which one can argue may be more valuable than gold in the modern economy. Another thing that's really valuable to me is you guys hitting the like button. Every like signals to YouTube that this is a good video and it should be recommended to more people. So please, hit that like button.
The traces of black gold in the Valley of Oil lured English oil investors to the remote and barren karst mountain range. String heat, lack of water, and the hostility of the local nomads couldn't discourage the oil pioneers.
During World War II, demand for oil skyrockets, and the resource becomes a major international issue. At the end of the war, the United States signs an alliance with Saudi Arabia, guaranteeing security of the country in return for privileged access to its oil.
Indeed, oil has been and continues to be the world's most sought-after commodity, which seems to have a limitless number of uses.
World War II proved to every nation how important oil is going to be in the future. The Saudis found that they were sitting atop the world's biggest oil field. Talk about hitting the jackpot. After World War II, things got a little messy in the Middle East. Here's a list of the wars that happened in the Middle East between 1945 and 1970. You kind of have to scroll to see the complete list. It's a lot. So because of this, the Saudi monarchy felt a little uneasy and decided to strike a deal with the strongest military in the world, the United States. In 1974, the Saudis agreed to sell oil only in US dollars, and in return, the US promised to supply them with weapons and guarantee their safety. Following the Saudis' decision, all the OPEC nations decided to trade oil in dollars as well. As I have covered in previous videos, OPEC is one of the world's biggest oil producers, and as demand for oil grew in the coming decades, the demand for the dollar grew with it. Here you can see the massive growth in the world's oil consumption. Most of this oil was being bought in dollars. That means these countries need to buy dollars and keep them in their reserves to make sure they can always buy oil for their citizens. Here you can see that the dollar is, by far, the biggest foreign reserve held by countries around the world. This comes with its own benefits for the United States that I'll cover in just a minute. But first, let's go to the second part of that Saudi-US deal that had a huge effect on our economy. When the Saudis agreed to sell oil in US dollars, they also agreed to something else. Something I don't see other people focus on that much, but I think it's just as important. The Saudi crown agreed to hold its excess profits from the oil sales in US treasuries. And slowly, it wasn't just Saudi Arabia, but most countries were holding their excess reserves in US treasuries. This meant that the Saudi-US deal didn't just increase the demand for dollars, but also increased the demand for US debt securities. So the US government is easily able to raise debt whenever needed because of this high demand. This debt has been a huge reason behind the massive economic growth over the past few decades. Now, as you can already tell, having the dollar as the world's reserve currency has helped us tremendously. But the benefits don't just stop at a domestic level. It also gives the US a huge leverage internationally.
White House deliver, as promised, swift and severe economic sanctions last week, targeting Russian banks, targeting oligarchs, trying to move to limit their access to that SWIFT system.
It's all happening under the Global Magnitsky Act, which gives the president full authority to sanction human rights offenders.
The U.S. has taken a myriad of steps to restrict the supplies of advanced computer chips to China, not just from the U.S., but from allied nations as well.
Since there's so much demand for the dollar is the most stable currency. This has helped more and more countries adopt it for trade as well. But if any country ever gets too unfriendly with the USA, like, say, Iran, North Korea, or Russia, the US is just able to impose sanctions on them and basically cut them off from the global financial system. Also, since a lot of countries hold most of their reserves within US treasuries, the US is able to freeze their reserves like they did in the case of Russia after it invaded Ukraine. The power of the US dollar is very far-reaching, and any bank in any corner of the world has to follow US rules if they want to stay in the financial sector. Now, I'm not going to cover every way that the government can use the dollar's power, but hopefully you guys get the point. The dollar as a reserve currency is extremely beneficial for us domestically, and gives the government massive leverage internationally. Now, this is the kind of power China would like to wield for their own country. That way they can grow their power and influence even quicker. Luckily for China, there are many other countries who aren't too comfortable with the dollar having that kind of power over them. So, China has been trying to push trade in its own currency, the yuan, to gain more of a leverage on the world stage. After Western sanctions on Russia, China and Russia trade has mostly been in yuan. China is also using its loans to developing countries as a way to push them to use the yuan for trade. I have covered extensively how the CCP uses sharkish loans to developing nations as a way to gain power over them. You can check that out by watching this video. Now, China is using the same leverage to increase the use of the yuan. China is requiring countries to pay back loans in yuan. This can be effective, if successful, because there are currently over 140 countries in China's Belt and Road Initiative. And if they all agree to use the yuan more, it can definitely give the currency more stability. China is also the world's biggest exporter, meaning that countries are buying stuff from China. Here's a map of all the countries that currently import most of their goods from China. If the CCP is able to convince even a fraction of these countries to switch to the yuan for trade, it can have big implications for the dollar's status.
Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Saudi Arabia on Wednesday. And what was on the agenda? To break the long-time U.S. dominance in the region.
China will also make full use of the Shanghai Petroleum and National Gas Exchange as a platform to carry out yuan settlement of oil and gas trade.
The visit is Xi's first to the kingdom in 6 years. The two countries affirmed their ties and signed a series of strategic deals.
And that is what Xi Jinping wants to achieve from his trip to Saudi Arabia. If you've seen my previous video on Saudi Arabia, then you know that US-Saudi relations have been a little rocky recently. I highly recommend you check it out, but here's a quick recap. President Biden visited the Crown Prince to get assurance that OPEC won't cut oil production and push up the price of oil. It seemed that that trip worked. But then, out of nowhere, OPEC announced a major cut in oil production right before the midterms. That's because the Saudis are not too happy with the US pulling out of Afghanistan and getting too friendly with Iran, plus many more issues. After the oil production cuts, Biden claimed that there will be consequences for Saudi Arabia for cutting oil production during a sensitive time in the world economy. The talks about passing the NOPEC bill also picked up, where the US would be able to sue leaders of oil-producing nations in the OPEC cartel. Of course, the Saudis were not too happy with all of this, so they floated the idea of maybe selling their oil in a currency that's not the dollar. And this is where Xi Jinping comes in. Saudis have previously shown interest in accepting the yuan instead of the dollar. And if Xi Jinping can convince them, then it could be a huge deal in China's effort to dismantle the dollar's power. Now, I'm writing this script at 2 a.m. the day before the trip has happened. But by the time I finish editing this video, I'm sure the trip will be done. Currently, I don't know what's going to come out of this trip, but I'm sure you guys are wondering, if Xi Jinping is successful, does that mean China will have the world's new reserve currency? Well, no. Let me explain. There are a lot of countries who are not comfortable with the US having so much power over them, and rightfully so. But this is not because they hate the US in particular, no. They just don't want any other country having power over them. I mean, think about it, it's human nature to feel uneasy when someone else has so much control over your future. That's the case here. So let's say, hypothetically, every country does switch to using the yuan. Doing that doesn't really solve anything. Instead of the US having all this power, now China would have it. And for most countries, they would rather deal with the US having that power than China. The CCP has a long history of manipulating their currency, punishing countries for questioning their actions, and overall being opaque with their plans for the future. So the chances of replacing the dollar as a reserve currency are low. And even if that happens, it's most likely going to be a big bucket of currencies that replace the dollar, not the yuan.
The year is 2022, and we are seeing a wide range of incidents and events that we did not expect. Or maybe more accurately, did not expect to take place so soon. Along with other heart-stopping news from the global landscape, we are now seeing China enter the conversation, and unfortunately, it is not for positive things. Even though we are still just in the first quarter of the year, one look to the west and you can see that the dragon seems to be slipping down. Yes, China's economy seems to be getting worse. And at this point, it just doesn't bode well for investors and those whose fortunes are tied to the Chinese state. I know after the Evergrande and Alibaba declines last year, many thought the worst was over, but no. It seems this dance has only just begun. Over the next few minutes, I will be explaining to you why the Chinese economy is getting worse and the reasons and effects behind this. For the benefit of your portfolios and your monetary interests, you will want to watch this video in its entirety. I can guarantee that some of the reasons you will hear here will shock you and inspire you to reevaluate your positions and investing outlook in general. When the second largest global economy starts slipping, it's wise to pay attention. Right, so without wasting much time, let's dive right into why the Chinese economy is getting worse. Talk about how China is suffering silently has not begun today. It has been a hot topic, even on this channel, in the past year, as different events and different situations transpired, both within the Chinese borders and externally, that spelled doom for the nation. As we go over the reasons that are acting as catalysts to the decline of the nation's economy, I will do my best to recap the videos for you point by point. But if you haven't watched past videos on the topic, I highly recommend you check them out on the channel. Now, sip your coffee and let's proceed. It is prudent that I talk about the real estate sector issues first, as the real estate sector contributes to 29% of China's GDP. Last year, one of the largest property developers in the world, Evergrande, had a situation that sparked what could only be described as the beginning of the decline in the Chinese real estate market. Let me recap it for you very quickly. Chinese property giant Evergrande, whose liabilities exceed $300 billion, failed to meet interest payments to international investors. That situation spooked investors who feared contagion across Chinese property and banking sectors, as the giant company scampered to find a solution. Evergrande also began selling assets to raise the money it owes to customers, investors, and suppliers, and its own employees. However, this did not last long. Finally, Evergrande failed to meet a debt repayment and defaulted on 2 bonds. There are several reasons why Evergrande's problems were a major concern in regard to the economy of China, and even on a grander scale. This included the fact that many people had bought unbuilt properties from Evergrande, and a default meant people could lose their funds in totality. Also, defaulting on international debts meant sending a lot of companies into bankruptcy. There are several other reasons, but you can learn about those by watching other videos on this channel. In 2022, the damage to the real estate arena has not been fully recovered, and in fact, it keeps worsening. The Chinese real estate market is falling at a rate of 1% per month, and this is sending property values all the way down. Also, other real estate giants are suffering defaults due to a wide array of issues. Not least among them is China's issue of ghost cities. You see, about 20% of the total urban housing properties in China, which account for around 65 million properties, are vacant. This 20% includes large sections of cities like Tiananmen, Thamstown, Binhai, and many others, which span across hundreds of square kilometers, but have far more empty buildings than occupied ones. Such ghost cities in China have well-connected roads, infrastructure, skyscrapers, and a variety of public spaces, but are vastly underpopulated and have vast areas that are complete without residents. Normally, the conventional definition of a ghost city is one that was economically booming with a large population but is no longer thriving. China's are the opposite. Its third and fourth tier cities are fully built up with the promise of becoming economic hubs. But due to high investment costs or a lack of economic opportunities, they fail to attract inhabitants. With money tied to unlivable, unsellable, and unoccupied buildings, real estate companies are in compromising positions. The challenge that then comes for developers can potentially impact China's financial system significantly. If several real estate developers and firms default, as Evergrande did, banks and other lenders may be forced to lend less. That could lead to what is known as a credit crunch, when companies struggle to borrow money at affordable rates. In this light, a credit crunch would be very bad news for the world's second largest economy, because companies that can't borrow find it difficult to grow, and in some cases are unable to continue operating. With the implementation of the 3 red line policy by the CCP, a set of rules that just put a cap on the amount of money a company can borrow, it was basically guaranteed that companies could not get new debt anymore. This resulted in the companies who were now struggling for cash suffering bond price sell-offs, along with stock price slumps. Given that about 90% of the Chinese population has ties to real estate and home ownership, it makes sense that such a reaction would occur. After all, if the company is struggling, who wants to own their bonds? Bonds meant to guarantee safety. Due to this, China's biggest bond saw $460.4 million of outflows last month alone, as an exodus of money from Chinese assets continued. Couple the declining real estate values, the ineligibility of real estate development companies to secure more money to finish and start projects, along with investors massively pulling money from Chinese markets, and the problems just pile up. When the factor responsible for almost a third of the nation's economy suffers such deep issues, then you can be sure that China's economy will feel the punch. Right, the causes of China's problems aren't done, however. Hang on, you'll really want to hear about the next one. If you haven't watched past videos on the subject of regulatory pressure by the Chinese Communist Party, I highly recommend you check out the videos on the channel. But here's a brief recap. The CCP has its hands in everything. By everything, I mean everything. This is evidenced by the Alibaba sanctioning that led to massive losses that the company still has not recovered from years later, and the Ant IPO that, despite being set to be the world's largest, was blocked by the CCP to inflict a major blow on Jack Ma. This came in the aftermath of Jack Ma giving statements that were regarded as offensive to the government. What the CCP did with Jack Ma, and has since done with hundreds of other companies, only serves the purpose of showing us how intensely difficult it is to prosper in China. Once a company begins to get too large and the owners too powerful, the CCP immediately intervenes to stop them from having too much power. What this does, however, is limit companies from growing to their potential. It also places a cap on the kind of growth one can have without being political, aka supporting the CCP. Because of the influence that the CCP has, it has, in recent times, been performing market manipulation at its finest. This means that there can be no faith that can be placed in the Chinese stock market behaving organically. The stock market has double-digit swings, both positively and negatively, frequently. And this does not bode well with anyone with the smallest idea of how safe investing should go. The CCP has even gone so far as to pump billions of dollars to inflate the Chinese stock exchange, when they have felt they were leaning towards the losing side in regards to public perception. This manipulation has resulted in money being lost in the millions by unknowing investors. The CCP, aware of this, has come out to say that they will ease strict regulations on both the stock and real estate sector. But this is a take as old as time. We have heard these same words before, and yet the result has been the same. With the CCP in power, China has become uninvestable. Foreign money is hesitant to come in, and given the fact that only 9% of residents in China invest in the stock market, this is going to cause problems of an irreparable nature to Chinese stocks and businesses. If you have Chinese stocks in your portfolio, or are considering buying some, this is the time to reevaluate strongly, or at least make sure you have the stomach for it. The reasons for the decline of the Chinese economy continue. You cannot afford to miss out on these next ones that I will discuss. Another major reason why China's economy is bound to get worse than it currently is comes as a result of China's actions on the world stage. You see, China, as of late, has a terrible foreign policy that has manifested in unstable or weak ties with the rest of the global community. You're probably wondering how that would have an impact on the economy. Well, let me enlighten you. China is an export nation. China exports consumer electronics, data processing technologies, clothing, other textiles, optical gear, medical equipment, the list goes on and on. The problem is that due to the foreign policy they implement, the nation is disliked by its best customers. This means that the trade agreements and relationships become very fragile. This is why analysts give China about 10 years to become a service-based industry if it wishes to continue growing, or at the very least preserve its progress. In light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, some fears exist within the nation and its economy that the USA will sanction China for its ties with the Russian government. This comes in light of China either supporting, condoning, or actively clearing the diplomatic way for Russia to proceed with what seems like generally frowned upon actions. Whether this takes place or not is yet to be seen. However, the possibility of it has investors on edge. One can argue that the domestic issues that China has also threaten to collapse the nation from within. Chief among them is their unbalanced population, which holds more elderly people than working-class folks, the effect of which will compound more and more with time as the effects of a low birth rate continue to plague the country. Soon we will see a working population whose tax contribution can no longer support a large base of retirees. Only recently, China announced that Shanghai, the nation's second-largest city, would be going into another lockdown, much to the outcries of many citizens. This started off as a level 2 lockdown, but now it requires everyone to remain confined to their homes. This has the obvious effect of negative economic growth. You see, it's estimated that if this persists in Shanghai alone, by the time the lockdown there is lifted, it would have had a 0.4% GDP impact on the entire nation's economy. This might seem small, but when you look at the size of China's economy, you can see that this is a lot of money on the line. Chinese cities have been having lockdown after lockdown since 2020, and this latest Shanghai lockdown further emphasizes the point that companies who had their businesses affected were making. You see, the Shanghai lockdown will affect the Apple factory there, and the Tesla Gigafactory that is there as well. If this continues, the aforementioned companies might wish to relocate elsewhere, which would be a heavy financial blow to China, from lost taxes and employment opportunities from those two companies alone. The last thing to note is that supply chain issues that were already a problem and are still in the process of being rectified will be magnified following the lockdown of such a big city, a city that houses almost 30 million people. The reality of the situation is that China is in big trouble. More trouble than many would like to admit right now. Between all the issues stated above, one can see that it won't take a lot of further catalysts to mess up the economy. I guess it's a matter of time to see when and how the Dragon of the West will react to this, and if indeed their economy will fall under the weight of all these issues that are plaguing it.
Everywhere you go, including on channels like mine that's critical of the CCP, you hear one thing. China's growth has been impressive. 10% growth for years on end. No matter the size of the economy, that's impressive. But do it in a country of 1 billion plus people? That's nothing short of a miracle. But what if I told you that the CCP has fooled everyone, including me? Their greatest feat isn't their miraculous growth, but rather having everyone believe that they have had miraculous growth.
China's rise has been something of a miracle.
This announcement comes as China's GDP grew by just
4.5% in the first quarter of the year.
After 3 years of widespread COVID-19 curbs, China's economy
grew 4.5% year-on-year between January and March,
beating analysts' expectations.
Consumption and retail sales rose in the world's second-largest economy.
So let me just first explain how this all started. Just last month, China released its GDP numbers, and surprising to the whole world, it was announced that China's economy grew 4.5% year-on-year. which was much higher than what everyone was expecting. According to a Reuters poll, most experts expected the economy to grow only 4%, while the IMF kept cutting its forecast of China's GDP growth regularly. So it's really surprising that the official numbers are much higher than everyone's expectations. Can China be lying about their numbers? I mean, it's not like the CCP has a history of lying, do they?
Where ethnic Uyghurs, most of them Muslims, have been unlawfully detained and mistreated.
What's surprising is the government isn't reporting many deaths.
Before jumping on, a quick reminder to like the video. My last video, I forgot to ask for your likes, and the video was throttled by the algorithm. And this just proves that your likes make a huge difference in how my videos perform. So please take a second and leave a like below. Let's first look at the history real quick. China's GDP has grown tremendously. There's no doubt about that. You can look at this chart here. But we have to ask ourselves the most important question. Who is counting this GDP? We're not going to fall for the stupid saying numbers don't lie, because in reality, numbers most definitely lie. But sometimes you just have to dig deeper to find that lie. You see, in China, GDP numbers are calculated and published by the local governments and the CCP. There's a big problem here, and to truly understand the issue, first let me explain how GDP calculation works here in the USA. For us, there's an independent federal agency called the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or the BEA, that calculates and publishes all economic data, including the GDP numbers. Now here's the true importance of this setup. We all know politicians love talking about their GDP numbers, whether it be in the US or in China. If things are going good, they love taking credit. And if things are going bad, they love deflecting blame. Basically, GDP numbers are very important to people in government positions. That's why the BEA is an independent agency, so that politicians can't affect the calculations of the GDP numbers. Additionally, politicians' policies do have an effect on the GDP, but the BEA can do little to nothing to actually affect the GDP. Let me explain. I'm sure you guys probably already know this, but here's the simplified GDP formula. GDP equals the sum of consumptions, investments, government spending, and net exports. That means when politicians pass a budget to build a new bridge or a highway, it's part of the GDP. But that GDP is calculated by the BEA, so politicians can't fake the numbers or lie about how much it is. And on the contrary, the BEA has no power to pass any bills to actually increase or decrease the GDP. All they do is calculate what the economy has produced. Good old checks and balances, right? The same checks and balances that are missing in China. Which makes sense, considering it's a one-party nation with totally legit elections.
China's once-in-a-decade transition of power was completed earlier today.
Xi Jinping
has just been elected president of China
as China's head of state
and chairman of the PRC's Central Military Commission.
And his nation is on the rise.
And a near unanimous vote, with 99.86% of the vote.
Won by 2,952 votes to 1.
I wonder what happened to that one guy who voted against Xi. Anyway, you get the point. The CCP has all the power in China, and there's no one who is beyond their reach. There is no such thing as an independent agency for anything, let alone for economic data. Additionally, China's economy doesn't work like the US. And no, I'm not talking about the communism stuff. Here in the USA, we measure how much the economy has grown, but in China, they announce goals and how much they want the economy to grow. Which doesn't sound like that bad of an idea until you start digging deeper. Beijing sends out annual goals to local leaders of each province in China. Then these local leaders are responsible for achieving these goals. Theoretically, they're supposed to do this by, attracting businesses, promoting entrepreneurship, improving infrastructure, and several other ways you can see here on the screen. But the problem is sometimes these don't always work. The economy naturally goes through peaks and troughs. But in China, that's not an option. You see, politicians' careers are dependent on hitting or even exceeding the target set by the CCP. Promotions are based on how well your region does. Worse yet, sometimes missing GDP goals can mean penalties like demotions or even dismissal. So, officials are highly motivated to make sure they provide results by any means necessary. Of course, that includes lying. But I will get into how lying has gotten Chinese officials in deep trouble, but first, let's go over the easiest way to hit GDP goals, and that is government spending. If you guys recall our GDP equation from before, GDP is equal to consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net export. Easiest way a government official can increase GDP is just approve more and more government spending. And that's exactly what so many Chinese officials have done. But unlike the USA, the central government doesn't provide funding for local governments to spend in China. The CCP sets the targets, but local governments are on their own when it comes to funding. Worse yet, tax dollars actually just go to Beijing. So that means the local governments have to get creative when it comes to raising money for local projects. I have talked about this extensively in my previous videos, but one big way local governments would raise money was by leasing out land to developers. So if you think about it, governments were directly benefiting from the real estate bubble. The more money a developer can borrow, the more they could bid on lands, thus helping local governments raise more money. Now, we already know that the China property market is slowing down, and to make sure the country doesn't collapse because of debt, the CCP had set 3 red line policies for property developers. But since the CCP's 3 red line policy, the revenue for local governments has dropped drastically, which puts some of them at risk of default. Technically speaking, local governments can't borrow money. So to get around this rule, they would set up companies called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs, which allowed them to sell bonds and borrow money. And since these LGFVs were owned by the government, investors assumed they were relatively safe bets. But they aren't as safe as people would assume. So here's how the government loans work in theory. As long as the money is used to create economic output that's more than the interest on the loan is a success. But that's where the problems start. Local governments aren't just borrowing money to improve their local economy. They are borrowing it to artificially prop up the GDP numbers so that they can achieve the goals set by the CCP. I always go back to this simple example to explain the workings of government loans. Let's say you're in a village and your government borrows money to build a railway line to connect the village to a city. Now, money spent on that railway line counts towards the GDP, and it's a great use of government spending because residents of the village can easily, get a job in the city because commute times are now shorter. Now, what if next year the government borrows money again and builds another train line, just like that one, because the spending counts towards the GDP, right? I'm sure all of you can see that this is a very dumb reason to borrow money, even if it increases the GDP in the short term. Now, I will admit, this is a very simplified example, but in reality, a lot of local governments in China are doing exactly this, just at a more complicated scale. They would borrow money just to prop up the GDP numbers in the short term. They're not worried about long-term ramifications of these loans because as long as they hit the CCP's targets, officials will get their promotion, and the future will be somebody else's problem. So remember this. Chinese local governments are over-leveraged, and some are very close to bankruptcy. We will talk about the effects of this later in the video. Now, let's talk about another way local officials increase the GDP numbers, and that's by just straight-up lying. You know how I said in the beginning, officials are the ones reporting the GDP numbers to the central government in Beijing? And then the CCP publishes it to the world. Sometimes local officials just increase the reported growth numbers arbitrarily. Since there's no agency to verify the numbers, and there's no checks and balances in place to deter this from happening. Crazy part is that the CCP even knows this. The CCP Premier, which is one of the highest ranks in the CCP, has told other countries that China's GDP numbers are man-made because of this issue. They know this is going on, but they're not too focused on fixing it because high growth makes the CCP look good. Even if the CCP wanted to fix this, the effects would be catastrophic. Since this has been going on for roughly 2 decades now, the fake numbers have compounded. You see, lying about a few basis points isn't a big issue to fix. But if you lie one year, now you have to lie a little more next year, and then the next one, and so on, and by the end of it all, the reported number is extremely far off from reality. On top of this, no one has any incentive to really fix this. Why would the central government want to fix this? It only makes them look bad in front of the world and their own citizens. And why would local officials want to fix this? It could lead to serious penalties against themselves. And in the past, the CCP has shown that it is not afraid to use capital punishment against government officials. But this really does beg a question. How big is China's economy actually? And how strong is it in reality? Now, that's something that is impossible to figure out from the outside, especially for a small YouTuber like me. Luckily for all of us, there are a bunch of people much smarter than me who have tried tackling this question before. Let's get into that. There's a study done by Professor Luis Martinez, where he looked at many countries' GDP growth and their nighttime light intercity from satellite imagery. Based on this data, Chinese GDP growth over the past 20 years may have been about a third slower than reported each year, leaving its economy significantly smaller than that of the USA. Now, this study mainly focuses on GDP growth, and if you want to read all the details, you can easily find it online. But Dr. Yuri Skasfot from the channel Money and Macro actually used data from the study to roughly calculate the actual GDP of China, and the results were kind of shocking. Again, I want to reemphasize these are rough calculations. It's impossible to get exact data because of the way the CCP operates. But according to his calculations, China's actual GDP is 60% smaller than what the CCP reports to the public. Yeah, you heard me right. 60% smaller. If you want to learn more about his calculation, definitely check out his video. But let's just assume China's real GDP is somewhere around 60% less than reported. That means the debt they have is astronomically higher than anyone has ever realized. Remember earlier we talked about how local governments loved borrowing money using LGVF? Now, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about government debt because of the issues we have with our own national debt. But one argument most people usually make is that our debt isn't that high, if we consider that our GDP to debt ratio is relatively small when compared to other nations. If we apply the same argument to China, we can see the true scale of the problem. The Chinese government loves taking on debt and continuously lies about their GDP. So their debt to GDP ratio is extremely high. I'm sure that the heads of the CCP are already stressing out over the debt time bomb that is ticking faster and faster. And only time will tell how it will play out for China and the CCP. The CCP has been extremely aggressive regarding Taiwan ever since Pelosi's visit.
In China and Taiwan.
China and Taiwan.
Taiwan in an attack from China.
Beijing now announced that it will hold military exercises.
China responded with military drills. It fired ballistic missiles towards Taiwan and repeatedly rehearsed the assault of Taiwan.
They have launched missiles, sent military ships, and fired fighter jets, all in an attempt to show the USA and the world that the CCP is not afraid to go to war to take Taiwan. But economically, China is struggling. It's going through a massive crash in its real estate market. The population is getting older, and the GDP growth is slowing down for the first time in what seems like forever. As you will see in this video, it's craziness all around. So let's look deeper into if China's fragile economy can afford a war with the USA.
The Chinese economy.
The economy is still being held hostage.
Assessment of the economy, we've seen massive downgrades.
The Chinese government considers Taiwan to be a breakaway region, which it intends to one day seize back.
China has fired multiple ballistic missiles.
President Biden is making clear just how far he'd go to defend Taiwan in an attack from China.
Now, China is facing an economic slowdown, and it's scaring the CCP. The big reason behind this is that China hasn't really had a recession in the past 50 years, which is extremely rare economically speaking. That's not to say they weren't close to a recession, but every time the economy showed signs of slowing down, The government would do something to alleviate the pressure. And it's worked every time. Until now. This time around, the situation is a bit unique, and the CCP's old ways will not work in terms of helping this slowing economy. Now you may be wondering what it is that the CCP did before to ward off recessions for the last 50 years. Let's go over that right now. And then we can look at why it's not going to work this time.
China's economy has grown faster than that of any other major country.
China's economy grew a record 18.3% in the first quarter of 2021.
China continues to prosper and grow.
China into a global economic powerhouse, second in GDP only to the United States.
Here is China's GDP for the last 50 years. Pretty impressive growth, right? A lot of this growth is directly linked to its relationship with other countries. Let me show you. This is when China opened its doors to other countries. And this is when it joined the World Trade Organization. You can clearly see from the chart that its economy just exploded once it embraced globalization and trade. Its GDP went from $1 trillion in 1999 to more than $17 trillion in 2021. Trade with the world made China the second largest economy in the world. It is strong, but, well, problems are still there. When we look at GDP per capita, China sits 79th in the world, with only $16,000, which is less than countries like Iraq, Thailand, and Argentina. This means that Chinese people are still relatively poor when compared to Western counterparts. In fact, more than 200 million people in China are still living in poverty, earning less than $5 per day. That number is a lot less than what it used to be a few decades ago, but it's still a lot of people. This is why the CCP's main focus has always been pulling people out of poverty by any means necessary. This is the main driver behind the CCP pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into rural China to help citizens climb out of poverty. And this is all great, and I'm not going to deny that. But things are always more complicated when it comes to the CCP. Let me explain. You see, right after the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, which by the way did not happen if you ask the CCP, the communist government made an unofficial deal with the public. The government would provide rapid growth in the economy and consequentially better living standards for Chinese people. In return, the public wouldn't mind the CCP's overreach into the personal rights of its citizens. I know this is probably not a trade-off many of us would make, but it is the trade-off Chinese citizens made. And if we look back more into China's history, it kind of makes sense as to why they would do this. Over the past 2,000 years, China has suffered thousands of famines, and each of them killed millions of people. There was no food safety, no political stability, and no peace. So for people who have seen their friends and family die of hunger, they would take any deal, as long as it gives them some hope of a better life for themselves and their kids. This is exactly what the CCP offered, a better life at any cost. Ever since then, the CCP's goal has been economic growth and pulling people out of poverty. In return, the public has given up inalienable rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to criticize the government.
The architect who laid the foundations for its economic miracle, Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping guided China from an impoverished rural country to an urbanized world leader in a single generation.
Under him, private companies were allowed into China along with foreign investment. Deng also created special economic zone.
This seemed like a good deal for the public, as in they got what they wanted. The CCP was able to deliver decades of consistent growth, which was literally life-changing for its citizens. The economy grew, and GDP per capita skyrocketed, going from $300 in 1990 to more than $5,500 in 2010. In a matter of 2 decades, average citizens' wealth grew almost 20 times. People who were born in poor village houses were able to afford high-rises in cities in just one lifetime. They went from having nothing to having access to electricity, airplanes, cars, refrigerators, and much more. If you're a Chinese citizen and your living standards are improving at such a rapid rate, you are probably more than willing to make some compromises with government overreach. The only problem here is that if the growth ever stops, people will start wondering if the trade-off is worth it or not. And that's a really scary prospect for an authoritarian government in a nation of more than 1 billion people. This is why every time global economies faced any turmoil, the CCP was quick to start huge spending projects like the high-speed rails, which was started in response to the 2008 global crisis. The purpose of these projects were twofold. First, they provided jobs for people who were affected by the global economic slowdown, and second, they helped continue the economic growth of China, because their country was growing and needed infrastructure to fulfill the needs of its citizens. This all worked spectacularly, because as the world economy was slowing down, China's economy was still growing at a pretty respectable rate. But the CCP took this a bit too far. Let me explain what problem the CCP faced, and then we'll go into what mistake they ended up making. Let's take a hypothetical village, for example. Citizens of this village have no drinking water. So if the government spent money on building a water well, it will hopefully give some citizens jobs, and it will also provide water for others so they can focus on other productive activities instead of just looking for water every day. Well, that would be considered a productive government project, and most likely, the economy will grow. All other things being equal, of course. But what if the government sees this well and thinks to themselves that if they keep building wells, the economy will keep growing? Well, that's not really true, because the second well probably won't be as useful as the first one, and the third well won't be as useful as the second one, and so on and so on. I'm sure you get the point. If the government continues making just wells, slowly these new wells will be completely useless, and money spent on these construction projects will have no return for the economy. Now, a similar situation started unfolding in China after the 2008 crisis, just at a much larger scale. The CCP had exhausted all the growth out of building high-speed trains. I have covered this in detail in a previous video, which you can check out at the end, but here's a quick recap. The first few trains were good and profitable, but then the CCP kept on building trains even though the return on investment slowly started dwindling. Worse yet, a lot of these constructions were funded by debt, and there was a lot of corruption. It's a pretty long story, so I highly recommend you check out the other video after this. This spending project worked in 2008 to stimulate the economy. But because of this enormous debt, the CCP had created a big problem that would cause a big headache in the future. The CCP also realized something, that they won't be able to keep up with the economic growth through big spending projects as return on the infrastructure spending is slowly dwindling. That's part of the reason why, for the last decade, China's economic growth has been slowing down.
In focus is China's biggest banking fraud.
Only banking crisis causing social unease.
Another financial crisis is brewing in China, but the world knows very little about it.
For months, they've been frozen out of their bank accounts with 4 rural lenders.
They'd rush over by the hundreds, grab somebody and beat them and kick them, regardless of whether it was men, women, the elderly or children, even people with disabilities.
This is an unsettling prospect for the CCP. China is still a middle-income country, and by some metrics, it's a developing country. Around 200 million citizens still live in poverty, and average yearly income is only around $11,000. This is why, when economic growth slowed a little in the early 2010s, the government started encouraging citizens to buy houses. This was their solution to keep the growth going. The CCP loosened the lending regulations, and banks started lending to everyone, whether it be companies or citizens. This, in part, helped fuel the growth of China's real estate market, which slowly became a bigger and bigger part of China's economy. The only issue was that this real estate market turned into a ticking time bomb for China's economy. I've covered this extensively in past videos on the channel, so I don't want to repeat the same old events too much. You can check those videos out if you want a big, detailed explanation, but here's a quick recap. As the real estate market became unsustainably big, the CCP realized that this can't continue forever, and they tried reeling it back in an attempt to get things under control. The CCP implemented a so-called 3 red line policy to keep the leverage in the industry under control. This made it harder for companies like Evergrande to continue construction on some buildings they had already sold to buyers. Couple this with the CCP's draconian zero-COVID policy, and it makes sense why the real estate market is near a complete collapse. The real estate market represented 30% of China's GDP and more than 75% of household wealth. A crash in its housing prices means a lot of families who pooled together multi-generational wealth to buy real estate are now suffering. Because of all of these and more, China's economic growth has been rocky. Last quarter, the GDP only grew by 0.1%. And for the first time in 30 years, the CCP is expected to miss the GDP growth target, which was set at 5.5%. If you go back to the deal with the CCP had with its people, the CCP is expected to provide consistent economic growth at any cost, and in return, citizens overlook the CCP's authoritarian rule. It is much easier to overlook certain things by the government when your salary is increasing every year and real estate investment is always climbing. But in the current situation, this trade-off doesn't seem worth it when economic growth slows down, but the government's authoritarianism only seems to be growing. Just over the last few years, the CCP developed a state-of-the-art tracking system for it to track citizens' every move. Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy has led to some apocalyptic nightmares like this one.
The country's overall policy of zero-COVID
policy of zero-COVID policy.
There are constant lockdowns and mandatory PCR tests around every corner.
Fences to stop people leaving their flats.
In bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
Electronic magnetic alarms are going to be placed on the front doors of some people in places where they have tested positive.
And the communist government now also wants to control how Chinese kids spend their free time. Most of you probably already know that China spends the second most amount of money on its military. But what may come as a surprise is the fact that the CCP actually spends even more on internal security than it spends on its military. This has been true for years before the zero-COVID policy, but with its zero-COVID efforts, I can't imagine how much more the CCP is spending to keep its citizens under control. The only problem now is that people are taking issue with this government overreach, especially with some zero-COVID tactics. The CCP has locked people in apartments for weeks, separated elderly from their parents, and even killed off pets, just to achieve an utopia-like zero-COVID goal set by Xi Jinping. The situation has gotten so bad that even people loyal to Xi are now voicing concerns about easing the zero-COVID policy. This is part of the reason why the CCP is screaming so aggressively about Taiwan. It wants to use it as a distraction away from internal problems, which there are plenty of. But screaming about a war and actually going to war are two very different things, and consequences for the latter are extremely dangerous. I'm sure the CCP has been paying close attention to Russia's attack on Ukraine. It was a big surprise for everyone, but especially the CCP, on how quickly and harshly the world reacted in terms of sanctions when Russia launched their invasion. Companies left overnight. Russian banks were kicked off the SWIFT network, and the US froze Russia's foreign reserves. The only saving grace for Russia's economy was that it had oil. China, on the other hand, doesn't. But, okay, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. We'll go over the oil issue in just a minute. But I'm sure some of you are already thinking, China is not Russia. China's economy is many times bigger than Russia's, but it's also very interconnected to the rest of the world, especially to Western countries. Around 1/5 of China's GDP is from its exports, the US being its biggest export partner, accounting for more than $500 billion, or about 17% of all of China's exports. And their dependency doesn't stop there. If you look at China's top 10 export partners, 9 of them are US allies. More than 50% of China's exports are going to countries that are likely to pick the US's side if there was ever a war. Now, some of you might say that I'm wrong to say that China is dependent on the USA and its allies. Because trade is a two-way street. Just as much as China depends on the USA to buy exports, the USA depends on China to provide those imports. Fair point. But, well, this is where things get kind of complicated, so let's try to simplify it a bit. We have to understand why the US and most of the world is buying so much from China, and not other countries like India or Vietnam. More often than not, it's about cost. For the better part of the 21st century, China has been the cheapest place to manufacture stuff. That's it. This is not the case of China being the only country selling these products, and we're beholden to the CCP if we want to get our cheap electronics. We are getting these because they are the cheapest. There are many other countries like India and Vietnam who would gladly take over the world's manufacturing if China were to, for any reason, stop. In fact, here's the list of the top 10 US exports. The biggest ones here are devices like iPhones and tablets. Apple, in fact, has already started diversifying their supply chain out of China into friendlier countries like India. And it's not just Apple. Here's a list of companies that have already started to leave China, and this list will only grow from here. This all doesn't mean China won't use exports as a leverage if it were to face sanctions. It most definitely will, because that's the biggest leverage it has. But manufacturing cheap products is easily replaceable. Sure, companies and citizens might face short-term disruptions, but everyone will soon find a new place to manufacture. China, on the other hand, has a lot more riding on this trade. More than $500 billion in revenue comes from these exports for Chinese companies. But jobs are where the real problems begin. Now, this data was really hard to find, so please hit that like button if you appreciate all the effort we've been putting into these videos. Also, let me put in this disclaimer. Much like any data from China, always take it with a grain of salt, because you know the CCP has a habit of misrepresenting facts. So China has around 120 million jobs in manufacturing, and around 20% of goods manufactured in China come to the United States. So let's assume if this trade is halted, 20% of the jobs will be affected. That's 24 million people quite possibly losing their jobs. And whenever it comes to the economy in real life, no event is standalone. There are always far-reaching effects. We have to remember one man's spending is another man's income. So, if 20+ million people stop spending because they don't have a job, other people's income will go down, and this will all have big catastrophic consequences on the economy. Again, I want to point out that these are not exact numbers, but at least you get the idea of the scale of the problem. Now, this is all just considering sanctions from the United States. It's more than likely that some European countries will join these sanctions, and quite possibly some big Asian countries too, so the effects on China's economy could be catastrophic if that was ever the case. And this will only worsen another problem that China has been having: wealth inequality. That's right. A lot of people complain that wealth inequality is a result of capitalism, and wealth would be equally distributed in communism. Well, I have some bad news for those people. China isn't much better when it comes to the divide between rich and poor, and this is based on data published by the CCP. So things could be worse than they let on. Karl Marx would be rolling in his grave. The COVID shutdown has only made these problems worse, and the recent real estate crash in China is hurting middle-class households the most. So if there is ever an economic slowdown caused by sanctions, middle-class Chinese citizens would pose the most danger to the authoritarian rule of the CCP, and hundreds of billions of dollars spent on internal security might not be enough. So, things are not all well at home for the CCP. While screaming war might distract the citizens, starting a war is definitely not the solution. Economically, China cannot afford a war, but that hasn't really stopped authoritarian leaders from starting one before. That's the problem when the entire nation's decision-making rests in one person's hands. Jack Ma faced this reality recently when he made the mistake of calling out Xi Jinping and learned the hard way that the government controls everything in China, even billion-dollar companies. If you want to learn how the CCP destroyed Jack Ma's legacy overnight, I highly recommend you check out this video on my friend's new channel and show him some support.
confidence in the financial sector has plunged.
Where home buyers furious at the delayed completion.
The root cause is a high degree of leverage.
Preliminary restructuring
Thousands of them have begun withholding payments.
Rural lenders in the northern province of Henan
have taken things into their own hands.
If you thought the Evergrande crisis was terrible, then this train crisis is next-level apocalyptic. China has managed to back itself into a position where it cannot escape without suffering more than a few bruises to its GDP and its ego. China's high-speed railway, an engineering feat that was once hailed as revolutionary and borderline miraculous, is now proving that not all that glitters is gold. Much like the tortoise and the hare, it seems that speed is not the answer. If anything, all speed has done for China is to accelerate the digging of a $1 trillion debt. Yes, $1 trillion with a T. What am I talking about? Well, join me over the next few minutes as I explain China's train debt crisis and how it's become the boogeyman that haunts the Asian giant.
One of the world's most modern trains linking a political capital to a financial hub.
That's caused considerable concern for many, particularly China as the main investor. This is Bangkok's brand new Grand Central Station. No high-speed trains arriving today.
State-run China State Railway Group has had its debt ballooned dramatically.
Let's start from the beginning. China first embarked on a high-speed rail project in 2008, completing the first in 2009. By then, China's first long-distance high-speed rail service covered the 968 kilometers between Wuhan and Guangzhou at an average speed of around 350 kilometers per hour. It was an engineering feat, and one that came with a host of advantages, both economic and political. However, it was an engineering feat that had been necessitated by the economic situation at the time. You see, in 2008, when the global economy suffered a hard recession, China found itself in hot water. China was a large trade partner at the time, and as things on the global market took a rough turn, so did trading prospects for China. That left millions of people who had worked in exports and imports, along with several other industries, in a position where they were unemployed. Instead of just doling out government stimulus packages, the government decided to launch a massive infrastructure project. This infrastructure project, just as you might have guessed, is the high-speed train project. Through this, the government decided that it could kill two birds with one stone. On one hand, the infrastructure project served as the Chinese Communist Party's efficient, debt-fueled response to the global financial crisis. This high-speed railway infrastructure would help with easier integration and travel within the country, leading to a more unified China. This also served the CCP's ambition of having everything within the long hand of China's central government, unifying people under one house, so to speak. On the other hand, China re-engineered its railway infrastructure to drive the demand for concrete and steel and create millions of jobs, and put all those who had lost their jobs back to work. By doing this, the government injected money into the economy, fixed unemployment, and saved several industries. Since then, the project has moved from being one necessitated by economic times to one of, well, pure flamboyance and a display of power. China's high-speed railway network has grown from that first 1,000 kilometers to a track length of over 38,000 kilometers, the highest in the world. High-speed railways now constitute over 26% of the country's total railway network, as the high-speed railway today connects almost every major city in China, with travel time just a couple of hours more than air travel, but with the comfort that only trains can provide. Now, I know this all seems rosy, and you might be wondering, well, where's the problem? And let me show you. This is the interesting, yet kind of dark part. Initially, there were rich dividends that were gotten from the high-speed railway endeavors. This was because the first rail lines that were made were very profitable lines due to the cities they served. Two that stand out particularly are the Beijing-Shanghai and the Beijing-Guangzhou lines that racked up a lot of money. To emulate this success and keep up the global perception that came with the high-speed railways, several lines started being built the nation over, many of which did not serve nearly as many people. Because of the disparity in the volumes of passenger traffic, many of the high-speed trains are running at high idle capacity. A good example of this is how a good number of China's high-speed rail routes are operating at less than 40% capacity. That is below what is needed to break even, and so they are running at a loss. These losses have climbed over the years to a point where it's almost laughable now. Most new high-speed railway lines in China have witnessed a sharp decline in their transportation density, and hence it has ceased to become efficient or wise to keep them running, leading to a few routes being shut off. In a little while, I'll talk about some of the problems that plagued the high-speed rails to the point where what was once a cash cow in China has now become a source of problems and a seemingly infinite money pit. Before that, however, let me explain the dynamics of what this self-imposed debt trap constitutes. I also want to take a quick second to say thank you for all the support my recent videos have gotten. Without you guys commenting and smashing that like button, I don't think we would have reached anywhere close to the views we've gotten. So thank you so much for that, and please consider liking this video too if you haven't already. It helps me out so much.
China has been the economic miracle of recent decades, but is it running out of steam? And why does this matter for the rest of us?
Yet infrastructure debt is piling up, and China is increasingly juggling to keep up appearances.
China, you see the airports, you see the bridges. They have bridges that are so incredible, you've never seen anything like it.
China's total debt rose to a record high 237% of gross domestic product in the first quarter.
And a lot of the sell-side analysts don't address this because A, politically it's dangerous, and B, it's very difficult to quantify this.
In the past few years, mega borrowings by provincial governments to monetize its high-speed railway lines have created a debt trap, which is now pinching the coffers of the state-owned Chinese railway company. The Chinese railway company's financial woes started nearly 4 years ago, when more than 60% of the high-speed railway operators each lost a minimum of $100 million in 2018. That year, the least profitable operator in Chengdu reported a net loss of $1.8 billion. In the same year, transport economists in China had predicted an impending debt crisis for the country's high-speed railway that was dependent on unstable government subsidies, with many lines incapable of repaying the interest on their debt, let alone principal, and were caught in a vicious cycle of raising new debt to pay off old debt. Consequently, since 2015, Chinese railway companies' interest payments have been significantly higher than its operating profits, shrinking its bottom line. These successive years of losses resulted in China's State Council, the highest organ of state power, curtailing investments in the high-speed railways to prevent the slide into a deepening debt trap. The new guidelines have stopped the construction of new high-speed railway corridors, primarily on underutilized routes that are operating at less than 80% of prescribed capacity. For China, which has seen the length of its high-speed railway network increase by 91% between 2015 and 2020, the new guidelines indicate that the country's pursuit of speed has come at a high price, $1 trillion price to be exact. In typical Chinese fashion, without mentioning a specific figure or even a range, the State Council asked all governments to ensure that their railway debts should be within a rational range by 2035. Along with these guidelines, the government body has suspended all construction in regions where the debt burden is high and surpasses its fiscal strength. Debt-ridden cities building underground or light railway systems, too, have been suspended. This includes stopping work on 2 high-speed railway projects worth over $20 billion in the Shandong and Shaanxi provinces. Shandong's 270-kilometer line has sought to connect its capital, Jinan, with its southern city of Shaoxiang. For the very present future, those projects have been shelved. But China's debt train has more long-lasting effects as well. The increased heat on the debt-riddled operators has also dented the bottom lines of the investment banks and the shareholders of China's Railway Development Fund. As bond yields nosedived and profits crashed, the Chinese railway company decided to liquidate RDF 9 years early to avoid paying dividends to the investors. Set up in 2014 to raise money for China's growing high-speed railway network, the RDF offered preferred shares with steady returns to investors. A fixed annual return of 5.5% was offered to the first 4 banks that invested in RDF, while investor banks that came later were promised 5.32% returns. Reeling under a record loss in the first quarter of 2020 as a result of a 54.8% year-on-year crash in passenger earnings, owing to the pandemic-induced restrictions on travel, the Chinese railway company has found it difficult to pay such high assured returns. To make matters more unpleasant for the investors, the interest rate on the 9 20-year bonds issued by RDF crashed from a high of 5.78% in 2014 to an all-time low of 3.97% in 2020. All this has been disastrous for Chinese investors, faith in the China state-owned companies, and overall faith in the high-speed railway as a whole. Let's briefly go through some of the key problems that got the situation to where it is. How did this feat of engineering end up becoming the next big bomb that's about to explode within China's Red House? 3 factors best explain it.
Chinese second quarter GDP growing at the slowest pace since 2020.
The problem is restrictions to control COVID-0.
The economy remains stuck in a stop-start pattern. With millions of people confined to their homes, consumer confidence is flat.
A stagnant economy, a shrinking workforce, and a growing elderly population.
That's why inflation's hovering at around 2.5%.
As much as this was a solution born from a global crisis, China's high-speed trains have severe issues plaguing them. These problems have contributed to low public trust and, most importantly, the giant hole of debt that China seems to have found itself in. Let's look at them. Since its inception, China's multi-billion-dollar railway plan has provoked complaints that it's too expensive for a country where millions of people still live in poverty. Critics say railway officials have diverted too much money to high-speed rail and should be expanding lower-cost traditional rail. The replacement of slower lines with more expensive high-speed trains has prompted complaints from passengers reluctant to pay higher fares, especially on shorter routes. The global perception of grandiose projects has outweighed the logic of having a reliable, affordable system. High-speed railway construction costs nearly 3 times more than a conventional rail line. Given the absence of freight tariffs, its operational viability is hinged solely on passenger fares to cover the capital expenditure and operating costs. The craze for high-speed railways has made China neglect the construction of conventional systems, adversely affecting the balance of the country's logistics mix. As a result, rail has consistently trailed road and water freight transportation for the past several years. This has led to growing investments in polluting freight road trucks and trailers, offsetting the environmental gains resulting from the high-speed railway. As luxurious and efficient as the trains might be, the ticket prices are considered exorbitantly high for most Chinese citizens. This is the opposite of what should have happened, as rail should be as cheap or cheaper than road transport, as is the case in several countries. China is the world's 2nd largest economy in gross domestic product terms, but most Chinese are still relatively poor, with an estimated per capita income of $4,300 below the world average, according to the International Monetary Fund. Many of those riding trains are migrant workers who return annually to their home villages. But for most of them, even the cheapest tickets are unaffordable. This has resulted in fewer people using the trains compared to the projections. And for those who use high-speed railways, in some cases, they would have been better served with traditional rails that China is quickly dumping in favor of the faster, more flamboyant option that has, to this point, served as a sign of China's dominance. Keith B. Richburg wrote in the Washington Post, China's expanding network of ultra-modern high-speed trains has come under growing scrutiny because of concerns that builders ignored safety standards in their quest to build faster trains in record time. The trains, a symbol of the country's rapid development, have had several problems, including the 300-meter-long rail section collapse near the Yangtze River. This has only served to heighten the public fear surrounding high-speed trains. We cannot talk of the high-speed train network in China without mentioning corruption. What began with the firing and detention of the country's top railway official has spiraled into a corruption investigation that has raised questions about the project's future. The huge spending connected with the rail expansion has also been blamed on corruption. Investigations revealed that more than 5 billion yuan of financial irregularities existed in the Beijing-Shanghai link alone. And this is not just recent news, oh no. Railways Minister Liu Zhixun was dismissed in the spring of 2011 amid an investigation into unspecified corruption allegations. No details have been released about the allegations against him, but news reports say they include kickbacks, bribes, illegal contracts, and sexual liaisons. After Liu's sacking, allegations quickly emerged that he had taken a 2.5% cut on high-speed projects. In February of 2011, there were reports that Railway Minister Liu Zhixun accepted $122 million in kickbacks. Zheng Shuguang, the Deputy General Engineer of the Ministry of Railway and Director of its Transportation Department, was suspended on corruption charges. China's state auditor revealed that corruption derived from the Beijing-Shanghai line amounted to $17 million. Many believe that this figure wildly understates the problem.
China's economy has contracted sharply in second quarter.
China's current economic crisis is very different from the past.
In the third quarter, China's economy grew 4.9%.
Many companies from the European Union gradually withdraw from China. The future of China's economy has once again attracted global attention due to a storm of protests by the owners of unfinished buildings in Jiangxi province.
So the question now becomes, is this going to be another meaner, worse-looking version of Evergrande, the crisis that threatened to topple the real estate market in China just last year? Well, it's a toss-up. The Chinese railway company still has some options that it can exercise, despite them being brutal. Also, the way the central government has begun to get involved by cutting down on new projects is very indicative of the role they may continue to play in the matter. Despite all of this, the $1 trillion hole burning in China's pocket is not just going to disappear. Somewhere, somehow, that cost will need to be compensated for. The near $1 trillion figure also heavily assumes that the interest will not rise colossally in that time, because if they do, that number will keep escalating. No matter how we try to dress up this pig, there is some bruising and hurting that will happen to China as a result of its colossal train debt. Only time will tell as to the extent of the damage.
China.
China. The factory of the world.
The world's most populous country is facing a crisis.
China's population is aging.
Fertility rates are at an all-time low.
Gender imbalance in China.
Rapidly rising number of older people in the population.
It does not have young people to man its factories or join its army.
China is facing a crisis, threatening to end the nation as we know it in the coming few years. China's population crisis has gone from a social worry to a government emergency, as the population decline now begins to affect industry and commerce in the Eastern Giant. While many countries struggle with overpopulation, China, the world's most populated country with more than 1.4 billion people, has a different problem. Their population crisis manifests in that the citizens of the Dragon of the East are just not having enough, fun time. Yes, low birth rates are the bane of the nation. And these low birth rates might be what spells doom for the nation. In this video, I will explain 1. How low birth rates became a problem to begin with, and 2. The social and economic implications on China as a result. Let's proceed.
The rise of China is the biggest event in the recent economic history in the world. So within 30 years, in terms of a growth rate of total GDP, China has break the record.
The biggest jump in GDP since China started keeping quarterly records in 1992. That is a very, very impressive figure. China seems to leave everyone else behind.
China's race to become the #1 economy. The output of what is now the world's #2 economy is expected to surpass that of the US.
The Chinese economy is going to be probably at least twice as big as the US economy.
But, believe it or not, China has a population problem.
给我100万，现在
The number of babies being born is going down.
China's population is aging. Seniors over 65 will make up a full third of the nation's population.
Well, we are about to witness a demographic crisis in China.
The seeds of China's present destruction began as a very different issue decades ago. In the late 1900s, China found itself facing a giant problem on its hands: overpopulation. The way the population was growing versus the agricultural output coming out of late 1900s China meant that such levels of population growth were simply unsustainable. In a bid to avoid hunger rampage across the nation, China decided to implement a very drastic set of policies, the most widely known being the one-child policy. Under this policy, families were limited to having only one child. The goal was that by limiting the number of children in every family to one, it would lead to fewer mouths to feed, and ultimately a more balanced population. This worked wonders, as the birth rate plummeted heavily over the decades that followed, so much so that it not only achieved its intended targets, but it then created a culture that has led China into the depths of despair that it is now in. But what the CCP didn't realize was that they were creating a problem for the future generation. You see, because of the one-child policy, theoretically, every couple or two people are only leaving behind one child, which is not enough to replace themselves. That's why the replacement birth rate is considered around 2.1 kids. 2 kids to replace each of the parents, and 0.1 for any unfortunate child deaths. Since the one-child policy didn't take this into account, it was just too powerful at slowing down the population growth. Talk about too effective of a solution. As a result of reduced birth rates, part of the problem with China's population is that it's aging out. As most of the population is approaching, or is in, retirement age, this creates quite the complex. Low birth rates and an aging population? Yikes. Let's look at the problems that come from that. Problems that are leading China into its destruction in the modern day.
The ruling Communist Party says it is scrapping a strict two-child policy in response to the rapidly rising number of older people in the population. Beijing has enforced birth limits for 4 decades, but it's now concerned that a demographic crisis could add to pressure on its economy.
China's population grew by only 480,000 last year. That was the lowest in 60 years.
In absolute numbers, there are 33 million more men than women in China today. The gender imbalance in China is most severe in rural farmlands.
For those who engineered the single-child policy, the gender imbalance has been the worst unintended consequence.
The first social problem that can be easily identified as one takes a walk in the streets of China is that, as a result of the one-child policy,
it began in 1980. Only one child allowed.
Decades of families without brothers or sisters.
These harsh measures did reduce the number of births.
Decades, right, for the population to rebound.
A symbolic example of state control.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
The one-child policy.
China has an extreme gender imbalance, as the nation has far more males than females. This formed as a result of parents favoring having male children to carry on the family name and bloodline over having female children. Practiced over generations, it seems that the effects are now in full bloom, as China has over 37 million more males than women. As simple as this sounds, this creates a whole host of social and cultural issues that affect the nation heavily. To begin with, China has a problem of bare branches, especially in rural China. This is a Chinese term for men who are single and are unlikely to find a wife in the future. As their presence in the rural landscape has grown, bare branches have increasingly attracted the concern of China's policymakers. In January of 2007, the Central Committee and State Council issued a report saying that the imbalance in the marriage market amounted to a hidden danger for society and will affect social stability. The government's anxiety over the surplus men is more or less buttressed by a growing body of research linking marginalized men to the likely spread of violent crimes, prostitution, sexually transmitted infections, and the trafficking of women. Several studies have drawn a connection between the historical outbreaks of peasant rebellions in China and surplus males. As we all know, the CCP is not a big fan of rebellion of any kind, so this creates a problem for them. Adding to the social problems that are being caused by China's population crisis, you will find that the gender imbalance is creating a high competition in marriage for the few females available. Chinese matchmakers always have more men than women, which means a lot of men go unmarried into old age. This further creates a disproportion in the birth rate, and it has also resulted in the thriving of online communities where young men spend money on females to find closure and comfort. This activity contributes to the collapse of Chinese morality and tradition in society. Consider this. China's population grew to 1.41 billion in the decade ending in 2020, its lowest rate of growth since imposing a strict one-child-per-family policy in the 1980s. The National Bureau of Statistics announced that China added 72 million people between 2010 and 2020, an increase of 5.38%, with annual growth averaging 0.53%. As these statistics show, the population crisis in China is only getting worse. Where it becomes an economic problem is that a good portion of China's active workforce is aging, but there aren't enough youngsters to replace them in jobs all over the nation. This creates vacancies in key sectors all over the country, and because there's no manpower, economic growth slows down. As you can imagine, this is the last thing that China wants as it fights to surpass the US definitively in several metrics. The sector that has been affected the most by this labor shortage has been the manufacturing industry, as there is not enough manpower to man the industries in comparison to the past. On the other hand, certain analysts have argued that there's not so much a universal labor shortage as there is a mismatch in labor. The younger generation is shying away from manual jobs like farming and industrial work, which makes up a significant part of the economy. This, therefore, leaves a gaping hole in the labor pool, leading to the same problem: vacancies and slow economic growth. But labor shortages aren't the full scope of the problems that come with China's population aging problem. Other factors exist that are equally as puzzling to solve for the government. The reality of the situation, confirmed by the results of China's most recent census, shows that the silver generation is China's fastest growing demographic. This demographic of senior people accounts for 1/3 of the country's purchasing, a fact that merchants and retailers are becoming aware of and factoring for. With growing spending power, more leisure time, and longer life expectancy, Chinese seniors are becoming a consumer group to be reckoned with. Given their growing will to live their golden years to the fullest, and taking into consideration how nuanced this huge cohort is, brands can create and communicate their products and services properly. China's population of people over 60 years old surpassed 254 million in 2019, accounting for 18.1% of the total population. No other country in the world faces such a significant demographic change. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, China's aging population will reach 330 million by 2030, accounting for 1/4 of the overall population. What this means in economic terms is that there will be a whole portion of China's population that will be retired and not actively contributing to the growth of the economy. Analysts have stated that the demographic dependency ratio, which is a measure of the dependence on a society's total working population, would go from 47% in 2019 to 96% in 2050. What this means is that in the not-so-distant future for China, for every retiree, there will be only one person working. This will undoubtedly put pressure on China's economy, as there will be a strain to take care of the retired population. Extra burdens will be placed on the benefits and the healthcare system, resulting in increased costs all around. Current estimates state that in 2027, retirement funds will peak at 7 trillion yuan but then go to 0 by 2035 due to the number of dependents increasing. As a result, a notable deficit will be felt between its inflows and expenses, monetary-wise, and by 2050, the deficit will be in the trillions of yuans. The difficulties in maintaining the liquidity of the pension system are forcing the government to take extreme measures, like attempting to encourage more births and increasing the retirement age. But it might all be a little too late at this point. The government is not oblivious to the problems being faced in China. In fact, the CCP, realizing the trouble that China is in, has long since instituted a two-child policy. In May 2021, the Chinese government announced it would scrap that policy in favor of a three-child policy, allowing couples to have 3 children to try and increase the declining birth rates. This followed 2020, where the birth rate fell 15% to record a dismal 10 million births. In addition, China has started to try and address the low manpower problem by moving towards technological trends and trying to use technology and innovation to supplement the industrial sector. Basically, China is trying to transition the economy from being labor-intensive to a technological one. But it's key to note that the industrial sector constitutes 38% of the overall economy. And until full automation, the labor shortages will be felt in the present moment and for many years to come. These measures, at this point, just seem like desperate attempts to resolve a problem that is now far more than skin deep. After generations of the one-child policy, there are now facets of the Chinese economy that are so deeply ingrained that it will take decades to reverse the effects. The question, much like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, is what will come first? The destruction of China or the rebirth of the nation?